is not simply the way life comes to us, but is the way all things really exist. In these talks, I've had to say a good deal about prayer. And before going on to my main subject tonight, I'd like to deal with a difficulty some people find about the whole idea of prayer. Somebody put it to me by saying, I can believe in God all right, but what I can't swallow is this idea of him listening to several 100 million human beings who are all addressing him at the same moment. And I find quite a lot of people feel that difficulty.
Welcome. We're continuing our series of lessons on Mere Christianity, a book written by C.S. Lewis during World War II to help the population in Britain to have a better understanding of what Christianity is and what it means to be a Christian, which was a very difficult time for the British people. If you remember, they were under constant attack from German airplanes, and so sometimes it's hard to keep our religion, so to speak. This book is written in four basic parts. So the first part has to do, and that sets the stage, and he kind of makes the case, the foundation for right and wrong and what the meaning of the universe is. And he comes out of that with this idea of a God. He's not at the point where he's at a point of the God of the Jews, the God of us as Christians, but he kind of makes a rational argument that the universe was made or created by some greater being. The next section is on Christian behavior, and that's the section that we'll talk a little bit about today. So he starts off with talking about morality, and then he moves into some other areas. And so today, part of that Christian behavior, we're going to discuss two major themes here. The first is forgiveness, and the second is pride. And so let's go ahead and start. As usual, we kind of, like in a normal Sunday school class, which this mimics, we read some from the text and then we stop and discuss. The only difference is you can't ask questions because you're on the other side of the screen. But I encourage you to have questions, and I encourage you to get a book and read it. It's a very enlightening read. So let's go ahead and start. This section is titled Forgiveness. I said in a previous chapter that chastity was the most unpopular of the Christian virtues, but I'm not sure I was right. I believe there's one even more unpopular. If it is laid down in the Christian rule, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Because in Christian morals, thy neighbor includes thy enemy, and so we come up against this terrible duty of forgiving our enemies. Everyone says forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have something to forgive, as we had during the war. And then to mention the subject at all is to be greeted with howls of anger. It is not that people think this too high and difficult a virtue. It is they think it is hateful and contemptible. That sort of talk makes them sick, they say. And half of you already want to ask me, I wonder how you'd feel about forgiving the Gestapo if you were a Pole or a Jew. So do I. I wonder very much. Just as when Christianity tells me that I must not deny my religion even to save myself from death by torture. I wonder very much what I should do when it came to the point. I'm not trying to tell you in this book what I could do. I can do precious little. I'm telling you what Christianity is. I did not invent it, and there, right in the middle of it, I find, forgive us our sins as we forgive those that sin against us. There is no slightest suggestion we're offered forgiveness on any other terms. it is made perfectly clear that if we do not forgive, we shall not be forgiven. There are no two ways about it. What are we to do? It's going to be hard enough anyway, but I think there are two things we can do to make it easier. When you start mathematics, you do not begin with calculus. You begin with simple addition. In the same way, if we really want, but again, it depends on really wanting, to learn how to forgive, perhaps we better start with something easier than the Gestapo. One might start with forgiving one's husband or wife or parents or children for something they have done or said in the last week. And secondly, we might try to understand exactly what loving your neighbor as yourself means. I have to love him as I love myself. Well, how exactly do I love myself? Now that I come to think of it, I have not exactly got a feeling of fondness or affection for myself. My self-love makes me think myself nice, but thinking myself nice is not why I love myself. So loving my enemies does not apparently mean thinking them nice either. Now that I come to think of it, I remember Christian teachers telling me long ago that I must hate a bad man's action, but not hate the bad man. Or, as they would say, hate the sin, but not the sinner. For a long time, I used to think this is a silly, straw-splitting distinction. How could you hate what a man did and not hate the man? But years later, it occurred to me that there was one man to whom I had been doing this all my life, namely myself. However much I might dislike my own cowardness or conceit or greed, I went on loving myself. Consequently, Christianity does not want us to reduce by one atom the hatred we feel for cruelty or treachery. The real test is this. Suppose one reads a story of filthy atrocities in the paper. Then suppose that something turns up suggesting that the story might not be quite true or not quite so bad as it was made out. Is one's first feeling, thank God, even they aren't quite so bad as that? Or is it a feeling of disappointment and even a determination to cling to the first story for the sheer pleasure of thinking your enemies as bad as possible? If it is the second, then it is, I'm afraid, the first step in a process which, if followed to its end, will make us into devils. All right, let's stop there. So, he's talking about forgiveness, and it's not as easy as it sounds. And most of us, if you've lived long enough, you know it's hard. And you know the bigger the transgression, so to speak, sometimes the harder it is to forgive. And so one of the things we need to remember about Christianity is it's a life. It's a lifestyle and it's a life habit. And so just as anything that we do, the more practice we have at it, the better we will be. Now, this is a really sobering lesson because it's occurring during World War II. And I think most of us would agree that the Nazis were not on the right side. There might be some of us that don't agree with that, but even them we would question their morality, so to speak. And even today, it's 2022, there are things going on in this world. We know there is evil. There are nations and people who are attacking other nations and peoples for only their selfish reasons. So how do we forgive them? How do we forgive an evil person? Well, he's making the case here. They still have a soul. Now, I'm guilty of this. I sometimes say that person has lost their soul. Well, that's not true. God never gives up on anybody, even though sometimes I do. So he's saying, we will not be forgiven unless we forgive. And the measure of forgiveness that we extend will be the measure of forgiveness we receive. This is kind of a difficult proposition. But he says, start out small. Don't try to forgive the Gestapo, so to speak. Don't try to forgive the most evil person or in your heart. Start out with your family and your people you're around, and even the challengers you exist with every day. And that's probably good advice. The other thing that he says is, remember yourself. And this is a problem we have sometimes. Some of us have a hard time forgiving ourselves. And that leads to a lot of distress. Ask for forgiveness, and you shall receive. And then you must move on, okay? That slate is wiped clean. Now, he continues, consequently, Christianity does not want us to reduce by one atom the hatred we feel for cruelty or treachery. Okay? And then he says, he has this story about, are we thinking the best of people or the worst? And do we revel in thinking the worst of people? And I think that really speaks to me, at least, because a lot of times when I read this story that he's talking about, and it's about a really bad thing, we don't want to let go of that. But what he's saying is, maybe there's something else there. We don't have the full picture. And we never have full information. God has full information. He can see everything. I have often thought to myself how it would have been if, when I served in the First World War, I and some young German had killed each other simultaneously and found ourselves together a moment after death. I cannot imagine that either of us would have felt any resentment or even any embarrassment. I think we might have laughed over it. I imagine somebody will say, well, if one is allowed to condemn the enemy's act and punish him and kill him, what difference is left between Christian morality and the ordinary view? All the difference in the world. Remember, we Christians think man lives forever. Therefore, what really matters is those little marks or twists on the central inside part of the soul, which are going to turn it in the long run into a heavenly or a hellish creature. I admit that this means loving people who nothing lovable about them. Could be ourselves. But then, has oneself anything lovable about it? You love it simply because it is yourself. God intends us to love all selves in the same way and for the same reason. But He has given us the sum ready worked out in our own case to show us how it works. We have then to go on and apply the rule to all the other selves. Perhaps it makes it easier if we remember that that is how He loves us, not for any nice, attractive qualities we think we have, but just because we are these things called selves. For really, there is nothing else in us to love. Creatures like us who actually find hatred such a pleasure that to give it up is like giving up beer or tobacco. So he ends this section with this observation. How do we forgive? Well, one of the points that he makes is we forgive by forgiving ourselves. And we don't forgive ourselves. God gives this forgiveness. And Christ is a great teacher of forgiveness. Remember, when He was on the cross, that's one of the last things that He said. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. So there was ignorance there. Now we move from forgiveness, remember we're talking about Christian behavior, to the title of a section he calls The Great Sin. And I must admit, this is one of my favorite sections. I don't know why, but it speaks to me. He starts off, I now come to that part of Christian morals where they differ more sharply from all other morals. There is one vice of which no man in the world is free, which everyone in the world loathes when he sees it in someone else, and of which hardly any people, except Christians, ever imagine that they are guilty themselves. The vice I'm talking of is pride or self-conceit. And the virtue opposite to it in Christian morals is called humility. You may remember when I was talking about sexual morality, I warned you that the center of Christian morals did not lie there. Well, now we have come to the center. According to Christian teachers, the essential vice, the utmost evil, is pride. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all that are mere flea bites in comparison. It is through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. He's not telling us anything new here, but he's reminding us. In fact, if you want to find out how proud you are, the easiest way is to ask yourself, how much do I dislike it when other people snub me, or refuse to take any notice of me, or shove their oar in, or patronize me, or show off? The point is that each person's pride is in competition with everyone else's pride. It is because I want it to be the big noise at the party that I'm so annoyed that someone else is being the big noise. Now, what you want to get clear is that pride is essentially competitive. It's competitive by its very nature. While the other vices are competitive only, so to speak, by accident. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only having more of it than the next man. Take money. Greed will certainly make a man want money for the sake of a better house, better holidays, better things to eat and drink, but only up to a point. What is it that makes a man with 10,000 pounds a year anxious to get 20,000 pounds a year? Is it not the greed for more pleasure? It is not the greed for more pleasure, 10,000 pounds will give all the luxuries that any man can really enjoy. It is pride, the wish to be richer than some other rich man, and still more the rich wish for power. Of course, power is what pride really enjoys. There's nothing makes a man feel so superior to others as being able to move them about like toy soldiers. What is it that makes a political leader or a whole nation go on and on demanding more and more? Pride again. Pride is competitive by its very nature. That is why it goes on and on. The Christians are right. It is pride which has been the chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began. Other vices may sometimes bring people together. You may find good fellowship and jokes and friendliness among drunken people or unchaste people. But pride always means enemy. It is enmity, and is not enmity between man and man, but enemy to God. In God, you come up against something which in every respect is immeasurable superior to yourself. Unless you know God as that, and therefore know yourself as nothing in comparison, you do not know God at all. As long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people, and of course, as long as you're looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. So he always gets around to this relationship we have between God and ourselves, and God and our fellow man. And this is a repetition of what Jesus tells us too. The 3 years that Jesus was in ministry here on earth, he continually reminded us of these points. It's what's in your heart, and it's how you respond to God and how you respond to your fellow man. Now, that raises a terrible question. How is it that people who are quite obviously eaten up with pride can say they believe in God and appear to themselves very religious? I'm afraid it means they are worshiping an imaginary God. This takes us back to Jesus when he's addressing the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the teachers of the law. I suppose it was one of those people Christ was thinking when he said that some would preach about him and cast out devils in his name, only be told at the end of the world that he had never known them. And any of us may at any moment be in this death trap. Luckily, we have a test. Whenever we find that our religious life is making us feel that we are good, above all, that we are better than someone else, I think we may be sure that we are being acted on, not by God, but by the devil. The real test of being in the presence of God is that you either forget about yourself altogether or you see yourself as a small, dirty object. It is better to forget about yourself altogether. Pride comes direct from hell. It is purely spiritual. Consequently, it is far more subtle and deadly. Teachers, in fact, often appeal to a boy's pride, as they call it, his self-respect, to make him behave decently. Many a man has overcome cowardice or lust or ill temper by learning to think that they are beneath his dignity. That is, by pride. The devil laughs. He's perfectly content to see you becoming chaste and brave and self-controlled, provided all the time he is setting you up in the dictatorship of pride. Just as he would be quite content to see your chilblains cured if he was allowed in return to give you cancer. For pride is a spiritual cancer. It eats up the very possibility of love, contentment, and even common sense. Now, I mentioned a word here, chilblains. I've never heard that word in my life. I'm 68. So, just as he would be quite content to see your chilblains cured if he was allowed. I figured this must be an old term they used maybe in Britain or somewhere. I looked it up. It's small lesions caused by inflammation of blood vessels after exposure to cold air. So, if you're listening to this, chilblains, you might have learned a new word today. I've never seen it in a crossword puzzle though, so I don't know if it's going to be of use to you. Before leaving this subject, I must guard against some possible misunderstanding. Pleasure in being praised is not pride. If someone praises you, take it as a gift and a blessing and move on. Don't think it a big deal, but say thank you. Don't try to make an excuse. We say in English that a man is proud of his son or his father or his school or regiment, and it may be asked whether pride in this sense is a sin. I think it depends on what exactly we mean by proud of. Very often in such sentences, the phrase is proud of means has a warm-hearted admiration for. Such an admiration is, of course, very far from being a sin. But it might perhaps mean that a person in question gives himself airs on the ground of his distinguished father or because he belongs to a famous regiment. This would clearly be a fault. We must not think pride is something God forbids because he is offended by it, or that humility is something he demands as his due to his own dignity, as if God himself was proud. He's not in the least worried about his dignity. The point is, he wants you to know him, wants to give you himself. And he and you are two things of such kind that if you really get into any kind of touch with him, you will, in fact, be humbled, delightedly humbled, feeling the infinite relief of having for once got rid of all the silly nonsense about your own dignity, which has made you restless and unhappy all your life. Finally, do not imagine that if you're really a humble man, if you really meet a humble man, he will be what most people call humble nowadays. He will not be a sort of greasy, smarmy, person who is always telling you that, of course, he is a nobody. Probably all you will think about him is that he seemed a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in you, in what you are, and said to him. If you disliked him, it will be because you feel a little envious of anyone who seems to enjoy life so easily. If anyone would like to acquire humility, I can't tell him the first step. The first step is to realize that one is proud, and this is a big step. At least nothing whatever can be done before it. If you think you are not conceited, it means you are very conceited indeed. Now, why would this chapter be so attractive to me? Well, because I see this in myself every day. I know it is the greatest sin, and the only way that I personally can deal with this is through God, through Christ. So we pray, we think, we dwell on others until we don't think of ourselves. And if we do, we see ourselves in the realistic manner, as he puts it, as a small, dirty object. But that's not the end of the story. So in our next series of lessons, we'll talk about Christian values, Christian virtues, and so we'll do that in our next session together. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a good day.